Rabbit's Expert Hardware and Furniture Clara. Open Monday to Saturday with everything household, homeware and DIY all under one roof. Furniture including beds, sofas, tables, chairs and occasional furniture. Plus paint, wallpaper, electrical, garden essentials and loads more. Call into Lionel, Andy Dell, call 05793 31189, find us on Facebook or go to experthardware.ie and type in Clara to find us today. Rabbit's Expert Hardware and Furniture Store, Oratory Row, Clara.
Broadcasting live from the little town of Clara, County Offaly, it's What's the Story with Lloyd Bracken. Get in touch today through all our social channels and have your say. Oh, and thanks for listening. Now it's over to you, Lloyd. What's the story?
Hi again, everyone, and welcome back to What's the Story podcast here with myself, Lloyd Bracken. On the podcast, we bring you all the stories from Clara legends and beyond. Last week's legend got huge support and the feedback was just unbelievable. That man was the great Martin Devine. It was great to have him on. And this week, we have another legend who now resides in Wicklow but still has a great affinity to his hometown of Clara. A man who was once admonished by the late Mother Teresa and has covered 2 World Cups in his capacity as sports editor for the Irish Independent. And in between, of course, he has written some great books for us. He's on the line to talk to me about all of that and so much more. It's a pleasure to introduce to you PJ Cunningham. What's the story?
Oh yeah, Lloyd. I didn't recognise that fella you're talking about.
A bit of gloss there on the intro, PJ, as we have to do. You'll be used to that now from writing headlines and that, but we'll get to that in a moment. PJ, we've so much to get through on the podcast. Let's go back. Let's re-jog the memories of our listeners. Where in Clara did you reside and what are your earliest memories growing up in the little town?
I'm from the Green in Clara, or probably East Green as it was called, not the green houses. It's the big grey house that juts out if you look up from the chapel on the right-hand side. Mrs. Rafter was next door to us, and the Bracken family came to live beside us. Well, 2 up from us then, of which you were a little pup at the time.
We brought down the housing prices there.
No, geez, you put the price up because it was a brand new house you lived in. But it was an amazing place to live in, the Green, because back in the 60s when I was growing up, there was very little television. And what there was, it was only RTE1. It didn't come on till 5:30 and it was finished at 11:30. So for most of the year, the Green Field was like Sky Television and BT Sports and everything. Because when I was a young lad, my mother would be putting me to bed at, say, 7 o'clock in the evening. But at 7 o'clock in the winter, there was either circuses out there or there was carnivals or there was travelling shows, which obviously didn't last beyond the 60s because, there was a change in the way people got entertained. Television did become more prevalent and all that then. I can remember epic World Cup matches as I saw them out there in the Green, soccer matches predominantly. And it was all the lads from the Green that were that bit older than me, Lord of Mercy and Tommy O'Hara, Johnny Redmond from 2 doors down, Dolans, the McCarthy's, the Fitzpatricks, all those lads from in the Green, Paddy Hines, Johnny Scully. And I even remember Ricey Scully, he was working in White's at the time, Mace, and he was running home for his dinner one evening around 6:30, and he had the Mace top on him, and he came out and played for 10 minutes, took it off, and then scored a few goals, went home, got his dinner, went back in to work late down in White's that night. It was a lovely place. Look, I know everyone says it about where you're from, but it genuinely was, because it meant that if there was a carnival or a circus there, you could eavesdrop on what was going on, and you could imagine what was going on inside the big top, even if you weren't in it. Watching the lads playing, like I remember Paddy Kilfoyle, all those lads who lived around us, they were my heroes. Billy Smith growing up, fellas who could score goals and dive in headers and all this sort of stuff. And then when we got to be that bit older ourselves, we went out there, the Peter Rickers of this world, John O'Hara's, Ronnie Hughes, all those lads, the Kilfoyles. We had a very, very interesting time of the year. You could tell the time of the year from the football, from the sport we played. Around January, we always played rugby. Now, we didn't have a rugby ball. That didn't stop us from playing rugby with a round ball, because Ireland were playing 3 matches and they were on the television. And then, obviously, different times of the year, we used to play rounders, which is kind of GA cricket, if you like. And then we'd play, obviously, Gaelic football or hurling, which came first in the All-Ireland. Lads would be out there playing hurling. So you nearly know the time of the year. All you had to do was see what the young lads in the Green were playing.
Of course, PJ, you had a panoramic view of the Green Field, so you knew everything that was going on firsthand.
Yeah, and it was brilliant because, as you say, there was a panoramic view. You know, my mother put you up to bed, but you could get out and sit. We could sit in the windowsill upstairs. And then downstairs, of course, the greatest character that ever stood and shoot at her in Clara was a man named Sam Rickard. He'd be Peter Rickard's grandfather, so he'd be the current Sam's great-grandfather. But that Sam Rickard lived next door to us in 59 the Green Clara. But he used to use our lower windowsill as his place for dispensing pleasantries to the natives, if you like. And he was the funniest. Now, my mother, like at the time when the F word wasn't that common and that, Sam had a great way of using all the supposed curse words. He'd hear my mother laughing inside because, you know, he had a loud voice. And of course, he told me years later, the more she laughed, the more he'd curse as people went by. They had their way of creating their own entertainment back then, Lloyd, as I'm just explaining to you there now.
Sounds wonderful indeed. Peter, tell me a little bit about your parents, Mary Jo and Frank.
Yeah, well, my mother was Mary Jo Dillon from Kilbride. She was a sister of Sheila Dillon, Sheila Debry as she became known. So the Debrys are my first cousins up in Kilbride. Still, there's 3 of them up there to this day. And my father was Frank Cunningham, and he had 6 siblings. His father died when he was 14. So people often say we were his second family because himself and his mother reared the first 7, or himself and 6. And of those, my Aunt S was the youngest, and she married Mikey White. They lived in Kilbride Road for a while, but then they built up where her uncle Peter Flattery in Church Street had a house, and he gave them a site. And my cousin Michael White, now there's 2 Michael Whites in the town, Michael who used to be from the shop, and then Michael from Church Street. He's my first cousin as well. It was lovely to have cousins around the place. Of course, my father was first cousin Jim Flattery, the famed postman, and my mother worked with Bridie Canty in the post office until she got married. So and all my father's uncles, the Flatterys in Church Street now, not the Flatterys up in Raheen, who were still there, but they were all postmen and well known in the post office in that era of the last century when they worked there. And of course, Jim only died in relatively recently, last year, probably a little bit more maybe. Mm-hmm. He was probably the oldest man in Clara when he died, but he carried a great history and he had great knowledge of going around to every house in Clara, and he used to drive the van to go around the countryside, if you like, you know, up into Kilbride and Raheen and Woodfield and all those areas. So he knew everybody, and sure, Jim was probably he was a little bit of a John B. Keane by the end of it all. He had everybody's story that he could have told if he had to do it, you know.
PJ, your mother, Mary Jo, died when you were just 12, I believe. What impact did that have on your life at the time? I know that's a kind of a pivotal age heading into your teens.
It is. Like, my mother was out of the house since I was 8. She had cancer at the time. Now, she never called it that. She called it the lad. People were afraid to call cancer. You know, they called it the lad, the big C, anything but except what it was. And you know,
why is that, PJ? Was there a bit of a taboo about it at the time?
Oh, it's serious taboo about cancer. Of all the diseases you could get in the world, that was the one that people, she has, you know what, yeah, she has the thing, the lad. That's what it was called, you know. But my poor mother, she fought it tooth and nail. She fought it for 4 years, you know. She fought the good fight, as to say. And it's only then you begin to realise the importance of community. And I remember seeing the community rallying round to my father. Like, she died in the August of 68, and we were supposed to be making hay. And of course, we were in minding her and things like that. And the farming kind of wasn't looked after. But you know, my uncle John Devery and my uncle Mike and neighbours and all that. And in particular, you know, I just talk about the neighbours each side. Mrs. Rafter was like a mother to my mother. She was a widow woman. Jim Rafter was her husband, and he was a great name in Clara GEA. He died many, many years before I was born. And she was there, Mrs. Rafter, and she used to go in and mind my mother every day. The Rickards and the Hugheses next door, the other side, like they were, Eileen Rickard married Ronnie Hughes, old Ron, as I used to call him, a great family. They used to mind it. And then B. O'Hara, who was Peter Rickard's mother, B. Rickard, she married Paddy Rickard. B. was the nurse, and she came over twice a day, 3 times a day, my mother, as it was getting near the end, Lloyd, the injections, you know, to keep the pain away, because I was savage, and it was something that I never got over, really. Like, you can talk about a fella in his 60s now, still talking about his mother. He should grow up some stage. But not a day has gone by, but I think of her. And I tell you why I think of her. It's a very funny thing. She used to feel that there was a smell of death in the room, and she used to want rosemary and lavender brought in because there's a beautiful smell off those herbs. And every day when I bring my dog for a walk here in Bray, even to this day, there's neighbours have both rosemary and lavender. And I always pick a stem and I think of her and have a little prayer and a chat with her. And, she died in that. And then I was a bit wild. There was a lot of things going on in Clara, like toss pits and everything. I was at every toss pit you could be at and things like that.
You have to explain the toss pit for us, PJ.
Like, there was senior toss pits and junior toss pits, and basically that time there was old money, pennies and threepences, sixpences, shillings, 2 shillings, half crowns, half dollars we call it. And people of a Sunday after the pubs closed, there was a big toss pit down behind Dolan's, Carey's, all that place, in at the back of that where people used to go in. And that went on for 2 or 3 hours. And I used to love it, look forward to it every week. And then during the week, young Ronnie Hughes, who was my guru, we'd go around the green and we'd have junior toss pits for marbles or pennies or tuppence. We wouldn't have had too much money that time, mostly for marbles. It was on the slippery slope to ruination, it was great fun. And sometimes you come home with a pocket full of marbles. You'd be weighed down with them. And you could sell marbles, 6 for a penny. Very, very good fun and things like that. But from there on, then, I was sent away to boarding school, which my father took an ultimate sacrifice, really, because he was there by himself in the house. Only my brother and himself. My brother had won a scholarship to go to Wexford, to Peters, and Sean Devery, my big first cousin, he'd gone there as well in the scholarship. So I was carted off, not in the scholarship I hastened to have, because they weren't in on my time. Now, not that I got one anyway, but my poor father was there to fend for himself. But when I say fend for himself, Mrs. Rafter looked after him. Mrs. Feehan up the road looked after him. The Rickards and Hugheses next door. And above all, of course, my Aunt Sheila Devery, but then his own sister, my Aunt Essa over him, and Mikey White's wife. She made him go over for his dinner and things like that. And they looked after him. So you couldn't but be very, very proud of all the neighbours there, the way they looked after him. And I have to say, us, very, very much. And then when my father died was the day I realised how important the GAA was in my life. And that happened in 1975, which was 7 years later. I was just turned 19 at the time. And I was in college in Dublin doing journalism. And the word came through, he had dropped dead, just going upstairs to bed. A lovely way to die, except he was only 70. And of course, that time 70 looked like the age of Methuselah to someone like me. You're 19. But like now as I get closer to 70, it doesn't look that old at all. Like it looks like the new 50, you know what I mean?
I do.
But I remember it happened, Daddy died the 17th of April, 1975. And his funeral was the 19th of April. I remember coming out of the church, and one of his great pals in life, he had 2 pals the same age, Billy Keenan in Church Street and Joe Keefe from the Curragh. Joe, the loveliest man. And I remember him coming to Ed, my brother and myself, and saying, what can I say? And I thought it was the most eloquent words that were ever spoken to anyone who was grieving at a funeral situation, because we knew he was having our backs. He was there shaking our hands, and he was a neighbour down in Woodfield where we had the land, and he always looked out for us. I never forget that day. When we came out of the church, John Nestor was there, the GAA was there, Mick Sheridan was there, the lads who were Nob O'Brien, the lads who were the GAA, Paddy Robbins in the town, they were there. And I said, why are they people there? And my friends, Peter Rickon, said, well, they're because you play for Clara GAA, they're there to recognise you, And I remember saying to myself, this is something I won't forget. And, while I could be a cocky bugger with the GAA and had rows with poor old Sheridan and John Nestor afterwards, they didn't pick me on the team. The GAA was always part of me from there on. And, even when I came to live in Bray many years later, still Clara GAA is what counted. And obviously, the town of Clara is the first attraction. Lord of Mercy, I remember when Bear Cowan died, there was a great editorial written about him in the Irish Times. And I think it was Dick Walsh wrote it. He was a famed political correspondent. And he said he was of Offaly. That's all he said. Well, no, he said more, but that was the main thing I took from what he said. And really and truly, that's word of is very important in all our lives. And we're only ever of one place, really, Lloyd, aren't we? And I'm of Clara. Simple as that. I'm the proudest man imaginable because I'm of Clara, I'm from Clara, and Clara is in my DNA and always will be till the day that I die.
PJ, you're very appreciative of the people of Clara for the things that they have done for you, whether that be standing at your father's outside the chapel and that. Like a lot of people I have on the podcast, what's the best thing about Clara? The people. They always say that. And even when Catch Buckley was on, he said that GEA was just tremendous when John sadly passed away.
John,
you still hold that quality of the people of Clara in your heart. It sounds like that you're taken back still by it.
Lloyd, look, I've listened to some of your podcasts and they're brilliant, and I love them because they bring so many variations. But we're probably a very clannish crowd to the outsider. I don't know, but I'm not an outsider, even though I'm a bit in exile. I still consider myself, as I said to you, Clara man and that. And, you know, speaking of John Buckley and speaking of the people who have died tragically in the last year, you know, Aoife Doyle and Ricey Scully's granddaughter and people like that, it breaks your heart. But I still have in my heart, you know, lads who were in my class who have died, you know, Tommy Daigan from the Green, Lord of Mercy, and Paddy Stanley. Like, Paddy was in my class and probably is one of the most sad deaths in our lifetime, because Paddy was caught up in the troubles up in Cavan or Monaghan when he was ringing his mammy home to say he wouldn't be home that night when he was only a young lad, 16 or 17. I still think of Paddy. He was on the under-16 team that I was captain of. Only time I was captain of that, and we got to a county final and we were beaten. But Paddy was great. Think of his lovely dad, Joe. And Joe had great, you know, it was Mr. Soccer in Clara, but I still love Joe Stanley. He was a lovely, lovely man, and I played a bit of soccer with him. And that's notwithstanding the fact that he was a GA man through and through. But the sadness to come from that, and like I saw his sisters recently on a programme on television there, and my heart went out to them because they're younger than me now. I remember them just about, but they probably wouldn't remember me. But they're still carrying the problem that it was never sorted who did it and all that sort of stuff, you know. And on a lighter note, you know, anytime we got a free class in school, Brother Phelan's class or something like that, there was two comedians in our class, Paddy and John Lowe. And Brother Phelan would say, lads, look, if we go for a free class, it could be too long an hour, it'll drag. And the next thing, Paddy would jump up and he starts talking about something. And John Lowe would say, how dare he say that? And John would get up and he'd pretend he'd be contradicting Paddy. The two of them do a two-man show, a two-men show in front of us for an hour, and we'd be laughing.
John is a huge contributor to the podcast here, and I'm forever grateful for John. PJ, can we just take a little step back? I'd love to know, you went to boarding school, obviously, as you mentioned, St. Peter's and Wexford. Describe your first week there, heading down from Clara. You're only a young lad. What was it like?
Like, I cried for probably 3 months, you know, like my mother was only dead. I was 12 years of age. I was sent off to this place. When I got through boarding school, the rest of life was a doddle because there was some rough lads down in Wexford. The first thing I got was a boot in the tail end from a great player called Martin Quigley. Get out, play at hurling. Sure, I couldn't play hurling. Some would say I couldn't play football either, but anyway, that's another point. But it was really rough. It was dog eat dog, and geez, you'd be bet up every other day, and you had to grow up and you had to learn to defend your own corner. And what I used to look forward to was coming home, and then I'd come home and I'd always try and cod me father and say to him, we don't have to go back 2 weeks late. They're doing up the college, and sure he wouldn't know. And I'd ring we never had a phone in our house in Clara, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later, but I go down to the kiosk, 31165, that was, I think, or 35, that was the number down there, I can't remember now, but, and I'd ring St. Peter's, and I'd be trying to pretend I was my father, you know, with, you know, oh, this is Mr. Cunningham, yes, my son is in, and his brother will mind him, we won't be back for 2 weeks. Sure. And you could do to try and get a few weeks.
Very good.
You know, and young Ronnie Hughes next door and Peter Ricker and that, they were mad for me to go and play with Ord School Kieran. And I used to go, I remember they had 2 matches in January. I didn't go back till they had the 2 matches played. Now, I couldn't, Brother Charles wouldn't let me play, rightly so, because I wasn't in the school. But sure, I was gagging to play with the lads, because that's who I played with all the way up. And they had a brilliant team. I think the one all before them, that Ord School Kieran team, that Sean Rickard, Lord to mercy on him. Sean was a classmate of mine. He was a great footballer from Church Street, young Ronnie, Brendan Daly from Ballycumber, Billy Clavin from Rahan. Peter Ricker was the cap. Peter was a great footballer, you know, in his youth. But Peter was an awfully minor, and he was very, very brainy footballer. And, you know, he did well for many years. And, we went up. But look, every year I got home, we used to play juvenile, used to play under 14, then started to play minor, as I say. And then I think it was 17, I was playing senior. And, you know, then when my father died and all that, I started to say, well, I'm a Clara footballer now. And whether I took it seriously or not, I took it as seriously as I could, I suppose, at the time. As John Nocton once said to me, if you were to take playing for Clara serious in your 20s as you did in your 30s, we might have won a bit more. So that he was admonishing me, but probably rightly so. It meant I kept playing even in my 30s when I was living here in Bray. I think it was 38. I drove up and down I promised Rosemary when I got married that I'd do it for 1 year more after we got married. Sure, I did it for another 10 or 12. And left the poor woman minding 3 or 4 children by herself 3 times a week as I drove like a madman up and down.
Peter, did you ever feel like that you missed out on Clara life as a result of going to boarding school? And did you ever kind of resent that choice that was essentially made for you?
I did, yeah, of course. And I still do. Like, in my opinion, ideally I would have lived in Clara for all my life and things like that. But sometimes, you see, you make the best of what life deals the hand to you. Like, I was home, I was home working in the Westmeath Offaly Independent at Loan, doing local matches in Offaly and doing all the various stories around Offaly. And then I got a chance to go to work in RTE as a freelance. So I gave up the job in Athlone and went up to RTE, working at night time. It was gas shifts, the graveyard shift it was called, 10:30 in the night till 6 o'clock in the morning, and doing the bulletins. And I found, see, when you're a young lad, you're ambitious and you want to see what level you can play at. And then I was doing some work in the press. Used to do the Central Criminal Court and the High Court in the press. And then I got a job in RT because the girl in the Indo used to work down in the High Court and Central Criminal Court. Lord of Mercy, Lorna Reid was her name. But she said to me, there's jobs going in the Independent. Well, I put your name in. And I said, put my name in. She put my name in on a Thursday. I had an interview of a Friday and I started of a Monday. That's the way it was back that time. There was none of this, what degrees have you, or what else have you got, or what did you do, or what did you not do. So I started working there, and I was there for about 25 years till a new editor came in, didn't like the look of me. So luckily at the time I got the chance to go to the Sunday Tribune as sports editor and deputy editor of the paper. So that was a step up in one sense, although it was a step sideways in another sense if you're being truthful about it. But it was great because the one thing I didn't like about the Independent, when you were working till 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And I had 5 kids and I wasn't seeing them growing up because by the time I got home at 12 o'clock at night, they were in bed. By the time they were gone to school, by the time I got up in the morning. And that was the case. So when I was working in the Tribune, it meant that I only worked one late evening, which was a Saturday evening. And it was brilliant because I was able to bring them down to their brother Urban. It was a brilliant concept, this, to get the young people of Clara invested in GEA. And it was a prestige to be playing for the Boars or the Green or Bogtown or Raheen. And my young lads played for all those, and my young lads loved Clara and they loved going down, and they got, one lad got it back at the tournament. 1 year, one of the lads won the tournament, best player in the tournament, and all that sort of stuff. And sure, it was like their All-Ireland finals, and Brian Cowan was Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, was presenting the cups to them. And
where would you get it, Peter?
They thought they would win All-Ireland. But move forward many years later, right, in a nightclub in Dublin, right? And who's there but the Bowl Shane Lowry? 2 of my younger lads now, Paul and Ronan, were in, and they looked over and they were real shy when they saw Shane, and they were saying, we won't say hello to him, sure we wouldn't know who we are. And after a few minutes, Shane bounds over to the lads and says, the Cunningham lads from Bray. He says, do you remember the brother Urban? And you say to yourself, where else would anyone do that? Here's a sure, the boys, they couldn't wait to wake me or to get up the next morning and tell me, guess who we were chatting last night, But Shane is a bit like Brian Cowan when he was minister and when he was Taoiseach and that. Like Brian, very approachable. Clara lads, no one ever had airs and graces about themselves, or if they did, Clara people
be taken out of you fairly quickly.
They wouldn't be long about telling them where to go. The beauty of that situation there.
Yeah, and what a homecoming we've had for Shane Lowry. We've had a good few homecomings in Clara, PJ. Dear, what's your memory of some of those?
Well, it's funny you should say. I can remember 3. The first one was Bercown's homecoming. I was a young lad, 12 I'd say at the time, and now it's the first time I realised I wasn't worthy I'll explain that to you in a second. We were delighted that this thing in Clara, that Clara could never have its own TD, that it hadn't a big enough population, that this, that and the other, that all you could hope for was to have an Oliver J. Flanagan or somebody represent you from afar, you know, that sort of way, or a Paddy Lawler. And when Bearcown defied all the odds to get in whenever he got in 1969, it was like winning in All-Ireland. Now, that's the truth of it. And I remember the cavalcade coming round by St. Anthony's over the bridge and coming in by Mick Devine's. And myself and young Ronnie Hughes were down, and we jumped up. You know, there was an open lorry carrying Bear, and he was waving to the people. And young Ronnie jumped up, and his parents would have been a big Fianna Fáil. But I jumped up, and the next thing some fella roared at me, "Get down, Cunningham. You're not allowed on this. You're Fine Gael," you see. So, in fairness to Joe Connolly from Kilbride, you know, Lord have mercy on him, Joe Connolly was a great Fianna Fáiler. He said, no, his mother's side are Fianna Fáil. Admittedly, he's contaminated with his father's side, all right, been Fine Gael. But anyway, they went up to the square, and the place was bustling. And as I said to you, my aunt was married to Mikey White, and Joe White was one of the great characters of Clara Town. Joe was the MC. He had a great amount of Irish. All he'd say is, "A cordia Gael," and then he'd go on in English, you see, and everything was a cordia and then on in English. But Joe introduced everyone and interviewed everybody, and then Bear got up and you could hear a penny drop as he spoke. I always remember him saying, "I don't only want to thank the Fianna Fáil people, for without them I wouldn't get here, but I want to thank the Clara people who voted for me after they voted for Fine Gael or Labour," because he said, "I needed those votes to get in. You helped me get there." And I remember thinking to myself, well, geez, that's not too bad then what your man was roaring at me. Some Fine Gael votes might have got in. But I remember that. And then I remember writing about it in the Tribune many years later when Brian, 2008, became Taoiseach. It had the same, obviously, he's coming home. Bear came home as a TD, which in its day, believe it or not, was as big a thing to the Clara people and the people surrounded to have their own man in the Dáil. Huge, absolutely huge. And the next thing then, Brian comes home as Taoiseach. And what a great night that night. Saturday night, I remember it well. The green was packed. Brian was over there opposite Jerry Roach's.
My claim to fame, PJ, I actually introduced the Taoiseach on stage that night.
You introduced him, and you know where I was standing out in front of our own house, where I stood on the green, mind you, and I was as proud that night as Punch. And I'll tell you another thing. It's 10 years, and Brian had probably the most difficult Taoiseach era of any Taoiseach that ever was in the history of our state.
Difficult times indeed, PJ. Do you think, PJ, that maybe there's another book in you, Clara Homecomings? What do you think?
Oh, did I tell you the 3 homecomings? No, I didn't. It's a good job you were there. No. And then, of course, I drove down with Des Cahill. In fact, I tell a lie, I drove him down because Des said to me, he rang me, he says, "Are you going down to Clara?" I said, "Of course I am." So we drove down, myself and Des, and as we were in Lisminey on the way in from Kilbeggan, who rings is only Ray Dart. Now, he doesn't ring, I'm saying us, but he rings Des. And Des, he says, "Where are you, Des?" He says, "I'm here with Peter Cunningham. We're just about to enter now." And we pulled up at Lowry's. We went in and Desi was chatting. Desi was MC, if you remember.
That's right, yeah.
Lloyd for the day. Desi and Shane are good pals. The next thing then we were told that Shane was a bit late and it was a scorching hot day, if you remember. And Desi he's a big lad and he was starting to sweat up a bit in the paddock, as they'd say. And he said to me, "Is there anywhere you can bring?" I said, "Come on over. I'll bring you over to my woman who's like my second mother, Eileen Hughes here." So I went in. I said, "Eileen, this man is, make him a cup of tea, give him." So Desi opened his tie and took off his top button. And sure, he was delighted that he was able to, you see, getting out and able to sit down in the cool of a house for a few hours was great. The next thing then, Shane rings him and out he comes. And by the time we came out of Hughes's, the place was full. The same as it was the night with Brian, you know, a Taoiseach.
That's right, yeah.
And I stood up on our wall and sat up there for the evening watching the whole thing. And I remember saying, you know, this is as good as it gets. And so, Lord, Emmy sang, Tommy Scanlon, who was in my class going to school, he sang, Mícheál and Murdo Hurtig appeared. There was great gas that night. And then everyone in the town had a great feeling of joy about one of our own doing well, so to speak.
PG, describe yourself as a bit of an exile. Why so?
You kind of are in exile when you're not living at home. You know, in exile, you probably long more for the people. And you think more about the people. Like, I could bring you back to the old Clara characters. I mentioned Sam Rickard. A man up the road there in Ahamore, Johnny Wells was a great character. Jack Johnson up there, going up to Billy Digans. Ginger Dunn. Ginger was another great. Joe White, I mentioned already. And then you had people like Packy Slammin, Lord of Mercy, who died very young in his probably 50s. Then like Packy Slammin probably had the greatest one-line wit of all the people I ever came across. Like he could put people in their box very quickly. Like the time Offaly were doing well, going to Croke Park. One year Westmeath played up there one Sunday, and I think Laois were playing the other Sunday, you know, and we came down at half time to get into the restaurant. And of course there was fellas with blue and white caps on and fellas with maroon and white, and we had the green, white and gold. And Packy shouts at all the the Westmeath and Laois lads. He says, "Stand back there, lads. Make room for the regulars." You know, we're the Offaly lads who are in here every week. So, like, that's the sort of. And Packy he was like a great character, but they were great. And I still think of those, and I still think of Mick Sheridan. Mick was a great man to have a ball hop with. You know, I'd hop a ball about the band to make it jump and catch it. But you realise that Mick Sheridan is a constant in my life, from the Tidy Towns in the 60s, Clara GEA in the 70s, and right up along. You know, he was always there. And there's people that are like pillars in your life, that they never go away. And you know, like I remember growing up, the Nolans, like they were Clara royalty. Of course, they were Offaly royalty, New York royalty, but they were Clara. I remember I wasn't able to speak to Willie Nolan when I met him first, because he was the first captain to bring Offaly to an All-Ireland final. Peter Nolan, like the greatest player who should have been brought back. We all heard that story. And then, you know, the Star done, like the Star was a star in my eyes. You know, Ricey played 3 years for Offaly Minors, won 2 Leinster medals, young lad. Like, and Ricey probably would have been on the Offaly team in 71. Now, he would say definitely, but I'm saying probably. Only he got that belt that time, and he never played after he was 25, you know. Talking about footballers in Clara, I think it was Peter Rickard asked Brother Marcellus, who I consider Brother Marcellus the great man of the Franciscan brothers of my era. Now, Brother Marcellus said the 2 best footballers that ever went through the national school in Clara were Paddy Hines and my own great pal, young Ronnie Hughes. Now, young Ronnie, I played with young Ronnie Hughes, the same team. Young Ronnie he wasn't fast and he wasn't big, but there was nothing he couldn't do on a football or hurling field. He just was amazing. And funny enough, here's something I didn't know until recently. Brian Cowan told me. Brother Marcellus told him the best hurler that went through his hands, and I was sure he was going to say Ollie Minnock. He didn't. He said Pat Innes, Lord of Mercy and Pat.
That's right, yeah.
Who was another great friend of mine, because myself and Pat used to meet in Athlone, but both of us worked down there. And Pat, as you know, was a great character, you know, a lovely, sardonic, gentle wit, but always, and you know, a great musician. Always had a smile on his face, Pat.
Yeah, Pat, an absolute gentleman. We had a great pleasure of doing a tribute podcast to Pat a couple of weeks ago there. PJ, there's a question in from Nigel McAvoy asking, who was the best player you have played with?
If you were to put a gun to my head and say, who was the greatest club footballer I played with in my time? Unhesitantly, I would say Noel Kelly from the shop in Church Street.
Right.
Noel was... you see, as Peter Rickard said, Noel had something most of the Clara lads hadn't got, which was pace. But Noel had a devil in him. You know, Noel wasn't afraid of anybody. He never backed down. He had a great pair of hands, and he read the game very well. Like Noel Kelly, he only came into the Offaly thing set up when he was past it in 83 or 84. Like he would have been coming up to 30 at that stage. Noel Kelly should have been on the Offaly team in 82. No doubt about that. No doubt whatsoever about that.
PJ, Pat Flanagan said you were a difficult player to play against, even if you were on the same team.
Sure, I thought Fla all he knows, and he knows that. No, But no, I tell you, I met them from both sides. I met the greats, as I said, the lads before me, the people at the Star, Lord of Mercy, and all those people from one side. And then I met all these great lads coming. Don't forget, I started playing for Clara when I was 17, and I ended up playing senior with them when I was 37. So what's that? That's 20 years, 21 championships, something like that. Yeah. So, like, the likes of the Sheridans were going out one in. Nob O'Brien played. I think I even played with Benny Roach. They were going out one in. They were the lads who were retiring. When I was, myself and Noel Kelly and those lads, PJ, we were coming on. Mickey Rickard played a few years with us. I think Sean Rickard might have played a little bit before he went to England. Like, there was a slew of good players came after us. And I always take my hat off to the likes of the Reynoldses and all those younger lads that came, because none of them had a fear at all of Forban or anyone. Whereas my generation had 6 years where Welsh Island won the county championship in a row. Then they had, I think, 5 years of Forban winning in a row. That's 11 years of your career gone without winning. No, you were asking me about being in exile, and that's a bit dramatic. But in one sense, if you're not living of a place, like the Nolans in New York, like the people who are living away, in different counties or different countries, you're not at home where you're from, but you're thinking of it. Like, I spent my youth going up and down to Woodfield from the Green. We used to have the cows out in the Green, and then to go over towards Nancy Daly's and Joe Daly's and down by Shearns' Duns. And that was a 1.5 mile trek with the cows each way every day. There were cows, there were athletes by the time they were finished walking up and down. They were ready for the Olympics. They wouldn't milk a whole lot, unfortunately. That was the only problem. But my mother, when I was young, like 8, 9, 10, I had a little bike and I used to have to bring them down and up. And she used to be terrified that time. Now in the 60s, there was the fear that these guys are come, or this maybe some funny sort of a fella come in a car and take a young lad away, And she used to say to me now, on your way down, see, if I was talking there, going down the Green Road, past Lully Quinlan's, Mon Flattery's, Maggie King's, Frank Stone's, and then when I got to Purcell's, I had to shout into Mrs. Purcell, Nanny Purcell, and Tom, who were there, hello, Mrs. Purcell. And then I went past Tom Bracken's. And
you were checking in on the way.
Yeah, and then at Billy Wires, hello, Billy, how are you, Billy? Yeah, Mrs. Wire, you can call her Billy. He checked in there, and then Joe Handy and Mag Handy had the shop at the crossroads, and then you left Johnny Malone on the side. There was the Hogans, the Cocktons, the Digans, the Devannies, the Manions, and there was the Lowrys, and then there was Telford's at where Fonzie Sayers is now, and then you got as far as Maggie Malone and Sam Malone. They were brother and sister, and once I got there, I had to, hello, Maggie. And hello, how are you? And I had to let Maggie know I was there, so that if I disappeared, my mother would know when he got as far as Malone's, or he got as far as Purcell's, or whatever he got as far. I consider that a sacred mile of road. Right. I think of all the people to this day. I think of the people down in Woodfield. John Casey, who was a man with one arm on his bike. He died at 63. I think of the three Sheehan sisters. Canon Lamb, obviously. The Nestors lived down, Mike and Mrs. Nestor and John and Mick Jr., who I hope is still, I heard he wasn't well, I hope he's keeping good now again. And I think of all those people, and they were part of my youth every day, because I saw them every day bringing the cows down or bringing the cows home.
Lovely memories to have, PJ, and lovely to look back on that. I have a piece of audio here from a good friend of yours, PJ Rickard.
Delighted to get a chance to speak about my friend, PJ Cunningham. Term lifelong friends is often used, and I can safely say that PJ and I are lifelong friends. From the first time I started to go over to my grandfather Sam Rickard's house in the front of the Green to play with my cousin Ronnie Hughes, we would wander out into Cunningham's farmyard. That was a wondrous place for young small kids coming from the middle of the town. PJ in his lifetime hasn't lived that long in Clara, but he has a big love of the town of Clara and a great affinity with its people. Maybe the two organisations that are closest to PJ's heart in Clara was the Musical Society and the GAA. I wouldn't be qualified to speak about PJ in the Musical Society. I don't know whether he can sing well or not, but I do know by times he can be a bit of a play actor. As far as football goes, PJ wasn't blessed with lightning speed, but he was big and strong and had a very good football brain, which made him a very, very effective and good footballer. I know he won a Leinster medal with Offaly under 21s in a very good team. And in a different era, he may have been an awfully senior footballer, but in PJ's prime in the early 80s, very good footballers didn't get on awfully teams. You'd have to be exceptional to get on an awfully team at that time. PJ played for Clara over 3 decades, the 70s and 80s and 90s, and eventually got his due reward with 2 county medals in the early 90s. PJ and I are both age 65. I could be about 7 or 8 months older than him. In that time, we've had some fun times, some good times, some sad times and some bad times. And PJ has always been there with me to laugh and enjoy, advise and help. To conclude, I'd just like to say that I've known PJ for 62 years. In that 62 years, I've never known him to do a bad turn or put down anybody. He has helped a lot of people, done a lot of favours for people, and done much of it anonymously. It's a sign of a very good person. PJ doesn't take himself too seriously. He's inclined to look on the lighter side of life in any situation if he can have a laugh. I wish PJ and his family all the best, good health in these difficult times.
That's PJ Rickard there. PJ.
Jesus, I tell you one thing, I'm going to employ him as my speechwriter from here on in. I'm just thinking there now, Lloyd. PJ's mother looked after my mother. And I remember the day my father died, I was telling you that I came down from Dublin and I went to my Aunt Essa's house in Church Street. And in the middle there was Paddy Rickard, PJ's father. Paddy, the night that my mother died, had told me, go over and sleep with PJ tonight, right? And here he was 7 years later when I was 19. He wanted to mind me away from the death house that night, And he said, here he was 7 years later trying to look after me again over my aunt's house. There ain't I can do for you, Peaching. He used to go on me, Peaching. And I can do for you there now. You come and stay in our house tonight if you want to again. No one can appreciate what that means. When you're grieving and somebody who is genuine offers you a kind remark like that, it means the world. Now, you don't necessarily pick them up on it, but it means the world to you. And, I would say that's really why I have such, I have an affinity with. And there's so many families in Clara. Like, I walk into Hughes's there. I never knock. I walk in and I put the kettle on if they weren't there, and they come out and they said, they might have seen me for months and say, PJ, are you here? And it's never, what are you doing here? Get out, or nothing like that. I can do the same in Scully's. You know what I mean? There's people, and obviously your cousins, you do the same in, but there are 2 houses that you just feel that, they're part of your greater extended family. And having that in life is very, very important, because loneliness is probably the biggest killer of the lot, and to have people that you can talk. And PJ is right. I'd ring PJ, I'd ring Ricey. We chat maybe, an hour. No problem. Brian Cowan, if we could have a chat with Brian sometimes. PJ Rickard mentioned one thing, the musical. I certainly would say some of my happiest times in my young life were in the Clara Musical Society. What a great organisation. People will forget maybe the Loughnans, Kieran and Maura, who were there. Obviously, they'd never forget Richie Rex or Rufina, because they were the heart and soul of it, and his brother, Donny Rex. And, there were families in that, just as there were in the GAA, who made it down through the years. And, there were people behind the scenes who were as important to it. The makeup girls who used to do it, Miriam Carey and Berta Kenny and Mary Fallon. And Kevin Fallon was always in it. Funniest fella. Kevin used to say, right, lads, we'll give her Sally Noggin tonight. We had these statements that, and it was like, Richie was such a funny man. And I hope people see that what I'm doing here is not trying to say he had double standards, but Richie, very funny. He'd give out yards to you if you didn't know your words, But Richie never learned his own words. And then he'd give out yards to you if you ad-lib the line, And Richie had ad-lib a line, but, what was good for the goose was good for the gander. I'll give you an example. We were doing Fiddler on the Roof. There was a Russian scene in it. It's about the Jews being run out of Russia. And the Russian soldiers came in and they were doing this Russian dance. And Magsy Scanlon was one of the lads, and they had these top hats and they had bottles on top of it that they had to balance. Now, they were screwed in some way, but that they didn't fall off, But in the middle of it, like, they were shouting and clapping and dancing and all you're supposed to. Magsy shouts, "Come on, lads, me old flower," or something like that. Me old flower came jumping out of it. And Richie came in and he was fit to be tied, And then I think of Richie, we were doing Viva Mexico and there was a flea scene in it, an imaginary flea. And Donny used to have the spotlight and be going from one place to another place as if the flea was jumping from A to B to C. And then Sean Gilligan, who was brilliant, the musical director, and Sean, a little small man with a big beard, you see. And the next thing, the spotlight came on Sean, you see, and Richie goes down, and he was supposed to say, "Can we have our flea back?" You know, and Richie, of course, had always Gilda Lily, but he said, "Can we have our flea back? But make sure it's the right one you give us tonight," you know. And of course, now you could argue that Richie would always enhance his whatever line he was doing, because he had a gift. But me and himself were Pablo and Pepe in Viva Mexico. Once Richie Rex appeared on the stage, the other ones, you nearly had to sweep them up with all the laughter, because he had one of these funny faces that he just look at you and exactly like he'd look at you and you'd be laughing all around the place. You know, he was so funny. And like the boys, you know, Kevin Fallon. Now I wasn't there the year they brought an ass in at the last night, you know, and Richie, of course, wouldn't be happy with that. But that was the way it was. Like, there was great people there, Lord of Mercy and Martin Malloy, who emigrated to Canada. Himself, his sister Bernadette was there, his wife Kathy were there. Vincent Dignam was a great guy, Jojo Handy, Bridgie Cunningham. You know, there was and Mickey Rickard was Fiddler in Fiddler on the Roof, as he was the Dodger in Oliver, was it? Yeah, I was there for Fiddler, Viva Mexico, Irene, Gypsy Barn, I think. And then My Fair Lady, I got married, I think, that year. And did Rufina break her leg, or she injured her knee or something? And Rosemary, my wife, is a dancer, and Rufina asked her would she come down to do the choreography. So I drove Rosemary up and down. That was the last year I wasn't involved in My Fair Lady, I think, but I saw every night of it, because Rosemary, I drove her up and down, and then you'd be there for all the performances just to keep the girls on cue.
PJ, I'd love to talk to you about your working life, specifically in the newspapers, editor, and of course you work for Westmeath Independent, you freelance with RTE and the Irish Independent that you mentioned. Your journalism journey has been very good to you down through the years.
And I started out in news and politics, and I ended up in sport. And they say that the sports department in the newspaper is the toy department. It doesn't really count. And I suppose it's right. It's always about winning a match or losing a match, but no one dies, if you know what I mean. Whereas real life news, there are people died and that sort of stuff. But I got to a couple of World Cups on the back of going to sport. I was in Italia 90, which was brilliant. And then I went to the USA in 94. And when I was over there, myself and Peter Nolan Jr., I was in around the New York area, Orlando area, flying up and down from those places. I played 3 or 4 matches for Offaly, because Offaly in New York were playing. Myself and Peter were midfield, I think, playing.
So you were working on the 1994 World Cup, but playing football.
Oh yeah, no, I was working in the 1990 and the 1994 World Cup. Like, every day I was sending in 5 or 6 stories, you know, about Andy Townsend's big toe might be fit for the match, and then stuff, who's out there, and you know what Jack Charlton said. I got to know Jack now. Recently, you saw the thing about Jack and dementia.
That's right.
It was a little sad, because I managed through, I can't tell you how, but I managed to get a pass which was more than a journalistic pass. It was a security pass. And it meant that while the journalists could only get so far, I could go in as if I was a security man. And I used to have great chats with Jack during the World Cup. No, Jack was, if nothing else, Jack was a down-to-earth man. And all he'd be interested in talking about was fishing, or he'd no interest in talking about, you know, any fannying about, as they say. He just wanted to do things very direct. And he was a very decent man, a very, very old-fashioned decency behind it all. I must say, enjoyed him during the World Cups, enjoyed getting out there and experiencing it. As Con Houlihan, the great Con Houlihan said, of course, I missed the 1990 World Cup. I was in Italy. And in some ways, what Con said was right. Anyone who was out of Ireland missed the World Cup, because it was great crack at home, whereas we were working like slaves over, because the newspapers that time, there was no social media, there was no much television. It was all to do with getting stories, and the newspapers were blocking off half the newspaper to fill their pages with stories. Eamon Dunphy having to fight with Jack. So that went on forever. Then when we beaten Romania in the penalty shootout, that went on forever. No, it was innocence times, great times, and we got an awful lot of good crack out of it, that's for sure, in the newspapers. And a bit before that, when I was in the politics end of it, I remember one of the highlights was being in the Ballyporeen Inn, I think it was called, down in Tipperary when Ronald Reagan and Nancy came in, and it was great. What did they call it? Secret Service guys? Yeah, they were terrified anyone had come up, pop, and shoot him. No, they did it. Of course, did they do it before or after? Did it anyway, sometime before or after. But poor old Ronald was a lovely fella. But they wouldn't let him drink a pint of Smithwick's out of a barrel that the owner, or Farrell, I think was his name, brought in. They had to bring their own one in and pull it because they had been guarding it. And I tell you, he was delighted to get the pint of Smithwick's. He was lovely, actually, in there. Nancy was lovely. We got great stories about the fact that they couldn't drink the pint out of the barrel in the pub itself. They had to bring in one because they were terrified that he was going to snuff it or anything like that after, you know. And then, of course, you mentioned earlier, yeah, I don't know where you got that about Mother Teresa. Yeah, well, you see, back then, Lloyd, it was very, very simple when you were a journalist. You had to phone everything in. There was no computers. There was no mobile phones. First of all, you had to go and get a kiosk somewhere, you know. And I knew there was Mother Teresa was talking. I think it was the Blackfriars Street in Camden Street church, and she was given a talk there, or at mass there. And I had a deadline of 10:30 at night. And what you'd have to do is talk to her, and then you wouldn't have time to write on. You go on to what was called a copy girl. And she would take what you wrote down. Now, you'd have to do it off the top of your head. You know, Mother Teresa said blah, blah, blah in Dublin last night. Speaking for the first time to the Irish Independent, she said that such and such should happen. You know, all this sort of stuff, right? So I got her at 27 minutes past 10. And Mother Teresa was very calm. And she was kind of giving little blessings to people. And I was there and I was jigging. You know, I was doing vertical takeoffs, saying, would she ever hurry up? Because I have 3 minutes to go or I'll miss the deadline for it. Wouldn't be in the paper the next day. So the next thing, she looked over to me and she said, you're going to have a problem in life if you're going to keep trying to second guess people and try to rush people. Yeah. Life is not about rushing. It's about the calm.
This is the great Mother Teresa now, telling you.
Mother Teresa says to me, and I said, I know, Mother, but I said, I have a deadline in 3 minutes, and if you don't tell me something, I'm not going to get paid for my day's work. So anyway, she smiled at that, you see, but she did, just as I was going, she caught me again, and she said, what I said I meant. Now, she's right. I'd say I didn't listen to her enough down the years, because if I had to be a bit more calm, I possibly would have cooled down a lot and enjoyed an awful lot more of life. But speaking of journalism that time and getting phone calls, you know, I have your mother to thank, Lloyd. We never had a phone in the Green, in our place in the Green, Clara. But the super rich Bracken's 2 doors up had. And if only Paddy Bracken knew the amount of times your poor mother had to come out day and night to say to me, Peter, the Independent wants you to ring them back. Listen, they're on the phone. They won't go off. You have to go to Galway straight away. There's a man there wanting to tell you where to go. Even now at this stage, I'm still frightful that your father might send me a bill for services rendered all the time.
He knows now anyway.
Oh, he knows now, but the thing with Paddy is he'll never forget, you know. And a few bob for him is as good for him as it is to me, even at this remove.
Some brilliant memories there, PJ. You're certainly very privileged to have seen all that and met the great Mother Teresa. What are some of your other highlights in your life, PJ?
There's no doubt, look, in your life, getting married, you know, is obviously the biggest day of your life. And it was for me. And I was very lucky to get a great girl in Rosemary. We've had 5 children. And as I said, what I love about them is that they're all mad into the GAA. They all love Clara. It's a great sense of family. And I didn't have that particularly growing up in my own house because Mammy died when I was young. And it was lovely to have that normality, for want of a better word, right through the years since, you know. And I suppose that's the greatest gift. The other gift is, I suppose, the fact that I love doing what I'm doing, which is writing. The Tribune, as you may know, closed about 10 years ago. And myself and Rosemary have a small little publishing company called Ballpoint Press. And we've probably brought out 40 books in the interim since then. I've done maybe about 10 of them, either co-authored them, authored them, or maybe compiled them myself. And just to tell you, I'm doing probably the one I like most of all at the moment. I'm doing a tome on GA grassroots stories. Now, they're not about fellas winning 10 All-Irelands or fellas being 50 years chairman of a club. They're about lads, the Packy Slammons of this world, rather than about John Horans or about the Liam Mulvihills of this world. And about the ordinary people with ordinary stories, funny stories, sad stories. And they're the type of stories I've been going after and getting. I hope it's a book that won't be just for a year or for a Christmas. It's a book that'll be for the duration of time, because it goes back, believe it or not, to the time Bloody Sunday. I have 2 stories out of Bloody Sunday, one of which was never told before, so I have to keep that as an exclusive until people buy the book. And then stories about vigilantes in the 50s and 60s, and stories right up through bangers. Like, I have to tell you this now, a sneak preview. Ricey Scully tells the greatest stories, and he's some of the great Clara characters involved, and they'll probably be coming after me when they read it. But it's stories about going to Cavan, to Tommy Dolan's place up in Black Lion, playing for the club, and going to Dublin, playing for Benny Roach's uncle's club up in Dublin, and going down to Tipperary, playing some, just really funny stories. And you say, Jesus, gasp what happened back then, which couldn't happen now, because, people were often overage playing, and people often only had one ball, a football, say, if you were playing. And often if they thought they were being hammered, they'd burst the ball and then have a replay and get overage lads playing for minors and things like that. So they're the sort of stories that are in it.
I have in front of me here some books, PJ, that you have written down through the years. Where did the inspiration come for these books?
The first 3 are growing up in Clara. The Lie of the Land is about working in Clara as a young lad, growing up on the farm, going to play matches. The Long Acres the same, and A Fly Never Lit, that came about because just where you actually built your house, or where your house was built, Nurse Robbins lived there. Now, older people would remember Nurse Robbins because she delivered most of us when we were born in the 50s and 60s. And she was married to John Robbins, who was a great mechanic up in the factory. And both of those lived quite near us, but Nurse Robbins in particular was very, very well known for all the things that she did around the town. Nurse Robbins started to lose it in the 60s, in the mid 60s, and she was talking to my mother about my mother, and she thought she was talking to Mrs. Raft, and she was saying to my mother, well, what do you think of Mrs. C down below? And my mother now talking, pretending she was that Mrs. C one, she said, you wouldn't want to mind her now, what she's going on. And Nurse Robbins said, Kelly we used to call her, Nurse Robbins said, a fly never lit there. And my mother said back, oh, you can be sure a fly never lit. So I was honouring my mother calling the third one a fly never lit, there were stories about my father in the being pulled out by the black and tans, and my granny having to save him from being flipping shot, because that shower when they came here, he was only, I think, he was born in 1904. He was both 15 or 16 at the time. And because he had to milk cows and come home late, because he was coming home late, they came over to pull him and put him into prison for the night, jail. And my granny seemingly jumped on top of him and said, if you're bringing anyone, you're bringing me out of here. And then she seemingly, I don't know whether she wrote to the Queen or she threatened to write to the Queen to tell them what they were doing. Now, they were some such scumbags, I'm sure they didn't worry too much about. But I had heard those stories, and I thought it was important to put them down in word form so that the next generation and the generation after it would have those books if they ever wanted to use them as reference material.
It's the same basis as I do the podcast here, that they're kind of an audio history for people to listen back in years to come. They mightn't be stand out now, but in years to come, sadly, when people are gone, look back.
What you're doing now, Lloyd, is what I call the first draft of history for a town. And we had it orally up to now. I try to bring the words to it. What you're doing is doing one better. You're bringing the voice to it. Like, the voice of Mick Sheridan will live for 100 years down the line because you interviewed him. The same with Catch Buckley, the same with Pat Flanagan, Martin Devine, the people, Danny Rabbit. And Danny, like, I listened to Danny and I thought I was going to get a heart attack laughing, because Danny is one of the great modern day characters of Clara Town, and he doesn't realise it. And he's had his ups and his downs, but what a great man. Like, there's so many great people in Clara, and I hope I haven't left out some of the ones that meant a lot to me. I'm sure I have, but if I have, it wasn't a sin omission. It was just forgetfulness. more than anything, you know.
I have a question here, PJ, from Tara McGrath, that you know well from the Clara Heritage Committee. Heritage now in our town is so important, and people are kind of waking up to it, I suppose, in the last couple of years, as thanks to people like Tara and the Clara Heritage Committee. But her question is, and she says, PJ, you have captured through your books the social history of your locality. Do you believe that we do enough in Clara to record, preserve this, or should we do more? And if so, what would you like to see?
Well, I honestly love, I spent about 2 hours the other day going through the deaths that they're being put up. Somebody's putting them up there on social media. People who died in Clara and Horsley. And I discovered my mother was the next of kin, Mary Delahunty, who was her aunt, who died up where Devery's house was up in Kilbride back in 1951. And I discovered what age she was, 50 when she died. You know, all these things that I didn't know about. And what Tara is doing, like, I follow what they're doing, the walks on the bogs. I love the pictures that are up. The Kennys, there's a man there, Conor Kenny's putting up great pictures. And I'd appeal to everyone in the town to put up pictures that remind us of our youth. Like, the greatest historian we had was Tommy Harris. Lord have mercy on him. Only for Tommy we wouldn't have as many pictures in the town that we have. You know, and then Brendan Kenny brought out that book. I think it was Brendan anyway. And, you know, similarly, the GA books are great, the ones that were brought out by the committee, the various committees. Clara is very, very rich in all this. And what Tara is saying, I would love now, if on top of what you're doing, Lloyd, if somebody sat down with the characters in the town and also put them on television or a video, if you like, so that people can see them talking. Because in a few years' time, you know, they will be gold dust that people will say, that's my grandfather there speaking, you know, that's my, and like, there's no time like the present. You can't say, oh, we'll do that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time. An awful lot of the characters in the town, they only have so many years to live, the same as any of us, you know, and if we record them once, the way you're doing it, they're there forever. If we record them in book form, they're done forever. If we just talk and say, I remember Peter Cunningham said this to me, but it's only an oral, you're handing stuff down orally, and it doesn't last as long that way. And nowadays, it's important that we keep it, that for posterity, that people realise the characters, the things we did, the people we knew, and how important they all were in the one little community, if you like, you know.
Peter, we're going to finish up with a quick fire round that we do with each guest. So we hope you're ready for this.
Oh, Jesus, I wasn't expecting this, but go ahead, shoot.
What actor would play you in a film?
Tom Selleck. They used to call me Magnum when I was a young lad, so I have to get him to play the part.
Favourite GAA football manager?
All the Clara managers.
Best thing about Clara?
Clara. And what I mean by that is the streets. The streets, like I at night walk up and down and I still see the streets. And then obviously no place is any place without its people. That's a cliche. But Clara and its people are the two best things about, and I hope they never change either of them.
Best advice you've ever received?
Always remember, you're as good as the next man, but you're not better.
What's your favourite song?
Now, if you're talking about Clara, it's The Little Town.
Who from Clara would you like to hear in a future podcast?
Ricey, you have to get.
Who's your biggest idol?
My view of what God is. And it's not a man with a beard and a skirt or a long dress up in the sky. It's the man I'm trying to get closer to, the near I'm shuffling off this mortal coil. And it's a spiritual person stroke being who brings us somewhere where we can meet the Packy Slammons, where we can meet the parents, where we can meet the fellas we went to school with, where we can meet the various people we knew and loved in another realm. And
the last question, PJ, on not the quickest of fire rounds now we've had on the podcast.
The slowest, I'd say. I'm sure Rickard said it was the slowest. Tell it.
PJ, we could have turned the ship on the Suez Canal quicker than that. The last one now, this is a £1 million question, and it's sponsored by Robertson Hardware, so you can head on down to Clara tomorrow to Nigel and Lionel.
What a great family. Jimmy Rabbit, I nearly left Jimmy out, and if I did, Jimmy Rabbit was the quintessential Clara man. He loved every inch of it, and you know what? A few weeks before he died, he said he'd love to win the lottery, and his family said, Daddy, why would you, have you not enough money? No, he said, I'd love to spend the millions on doing Clara up to the best it could possibly be. And now, Jimmy Rabbit, I love Jimmy Rabbit, and he played at my wedding, would you believe? And Ricey Scully got up, and at the end, Jimmy played Stranger on the Shore. And Ricey said, and he was only codding a little bit. He said, Ackerbilk copied that from Jimmy Rabbit. And you know what? Yeah. Jimmy, no one played it like Jimmy Rabbit. Sorry, I'm not stopping you midfield. Go ahead
that's
there.
a fact. That's a nice tribute. Here we go. So, it's an easy one for you now. It's not too far back. In 1718, which pirate died in battle off the coast of what is now North Carolina? Was it A, Calico Jack, B, Blackbeard, C, Bartholomew Roberts, or D, Captain Kidd?
Jesus Christ.
Nice handy one.
That's a nice handy one, yeah. You only get, how many you get? 4. Haven't got a clue. I go for Captain, go for the last one.
Captain Kidd.
Yeah.
You're wrong, PJ. It was Blackbeard. So rabbits are keeping their million.
Well, I tell you, rabbits deserve it. And long may they prosper. They're a great, great family.
PJ, lastly on the podcast, is there any advice out there you would give, maybe to an upcoming journalist, or even advice to the younger people of Clara now?
Well, journalism, as I knew it, is kind of no more. It's all now done social journalism almost. And the newspapers aren't going to survive. It's as simple as that. There's going to be maybe one. And what I would say to people who like that sort of stuff is to improve your writing and also get a good grounding, because an awful lot of the journalists nowadays, to get a degree that they're qualified, you're not. You have to go on doorstep, as they say. You have to go and learn from the University of Hard Knocks. If you come out of college and think that you're ready to roll, you'll be in for a big shock, because you have to actually serve your time no matter what you do.
PJ, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast with me today.
No, sure, the pleasure is all mine, and I'm sorry I went on too long, but as I say, it's not too often I get to speak like this.
No problem, PJ. Thanks a million.
My pleasure.
That's it, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast with PJ Cunningham. It was great insight into the world of journalism and some great stories back from many, many years ago in Clara, and really an education to myself, which is lovely to get. I'd just like to wish Florrie Cornley a big happy birthday from all her grandchildren and her wonderful family. So Florrie Cornley, a very happy birthday. We're going to leave you with this song that PJ has chosen throughout the podcast. It's Tommy Stones with The Little Town of Clara. Have a great Easter, everybody, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. There's a spot I'll always cherish, no matter where I roam. It's a little town in Offaly, my own dear native home. A site of industry where hundreds are employed. It's the little town of Clara where the Brusna waters glide. Her matchless gems of beauty are rarely to be seen. The pond is pure as crystal, the hills are evergreen. The old historic abbey of St. Bridget at Kilbride, not far from dear old Clara where the Brusna waters glide. The flowery dells of very hills, they bedeck the bond, and overlook the far-famed mills of dear old Lashawan. It's there they spin and weave the twines, the finest are supplied. It's the little town of Clara where the Brusna waters glide. It's well I do remember my boyhood days at school. The sisters and the brothers, they taught me every rule. The past and present pupils,
friends can look on them with pride. In the little town of Clara where the brush and the waters glide. Now scattered are the loyal band of whom I once was one. Some died in France or Flanders beneath the Marxist gun, and some are in America where land and sea divide. Far away from dear old Clara where the brass and the waters glide. Farewell to all companions, I've sailed across the main. All comrades too, both loyal and true, that I ne'er might see again. My heart it's in my native town, where once I did reside. It's the little town of Clara where the brass and the waters glide.
Rabbit's Expert Hardware and Furniture Clara. Open Monday to Saturday with everything household, homeware and DIY all under one roof. Furniture including beds, sofas, tables, chairs and occasional furniture. Plus paint, wallpaper, electrical, garden essentials and loads more. Call into Lionel, Andy Dell, call 05793 31189, find us on Facebook or go to experthardware.ie and type in Clara to find us today. Rabbit's Expert Hardware and Furniture Store, Oratory Row, Clara.